This incident happened in one of New York City's most prestigious banks. Inside, the atmosphere is calm and filled with quiet power. Clients, dressed in tailored suits, casually discuss investments and business deals, their voices low but confident. The tall glass windows overlook the bustling streets of Manhattan, where yellow cabs and sleek black SUVs pass by. Behind the counter stands Jessica, a young bank teller, preparing for her shift. She adjusts her name tag and takes a deep breath. The weight of her responsibilities presses down on her as she watches the clients around her. Jessica's job here means more than just a paycheck, it's a lifeline for her family. After losing her parents in a car accident 3 years ago, she became the caretaker for her 2 younger brothers. Every day, she works hard to keep everything in balance, knowing that any mistake could cost her the stability she has fought so hard to maintain. Her nerves are on edge as she watches the clock tick closer to the start of another busy day. For Jessica, this job is not just about money, it's about keeping her family together and ensuring her brothers have everything they need. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as the bank doors swung open. She didn't expect anyone special to walk in today, but when Melania Trump stepped through, it was like the world shifted. Melania's presence was undeniable. She entered with an air of confidence, wearing a well-tailored outfit that seemed to catch the light perfectly. Her grace commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Heads turned, and whispers quickly spread through the bank. She moved through the lobby like she owned it, and Jessica couldn't help but stare. Jessica quickly adjusted her posture behind the counter. She knew she had a job to do, and she had to stay focused. As Melania approached, Jessica forced a smile, trying to steady her nerves. She greeted her with the same polite tone she used with every client, but inside, she was nervous. "Good morning, Mrs. Trump. How can I assist you today?" Melania smiled warmly, her voice calm and professional. "I need to make a transfer and access my safety deposit box." Her tone made it sound like any other visit to a bank. But Jessica knew this was different. As Jessica entered Melania's details into the system, she tried to maintain her focus. But then something happened that she didn't expect. The screen flashed red, a warning popping up, "High-value transaction. Verification required." Jessica's stomach sank. She glanced at the message again, hoping it was a mistake, but no, the system was firm. The transaction couldn't proceed without further verification. She quickly checked the information she had entered. Everything seemed fine, Melania had handed over her ID with no issue, but the system wasn't letting her move forward. Jessica swallowed, her mind racing. She had been warned about this during training. The new bank policies were strict, every transaction, no matter how big or small, had to be verified thoroughly. Even the slightest mistake could result in a major problem. But dealing with Melania Trump, someone so high-profile, was a different kind of pressure. She didn't know what to do. Taking a deep breath, Jessica spoke, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Trump, I'm so sorry, but I need to verify your identity with an additional security step. It's part of our bank's new policy." Melania's expression shifted slightly. There was no anger, but a faint flicker of surprise in her eyes. "I just handed you my ID," she said, a hint of confusion in her voice. "I understand, but the system is flagging the transaction. I need to complete this extra step to proceed," Jessica explained, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. Melania raised an eyebrow, looking at her assistant for a moment before returning her gaze to Jessica. "This is unnecessary. I'm just trying to access my account." Jessica felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was caught between following the rules and the reality of dealing with someone as important as Melania Trump. She could feel the eyes of other clients on her now, their judgment hanging in the air. Some clients were whispering, and others looked on with curiosity, wondering what would happen next. Her hands were sweating, and her mind raced. She had to keep following protocol. It was what she was trained to do. But what if this decision would make things worse? What if she had misunderstood the situation, or worse, offended someone as powerful as Melania Trump? Jessica forced herself to take another breath. This was her job, and it was her responsibility to uphold the bank's rules. But still, as she explained the need for the additional verification, she could feel the pressure building. As Jessica waited for Melania's response, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with every second. Would Melania get frustrated? Would she ask for another teller? Or worse, would she escalate the situation? All these thoughts raced through Jessica's mind as she tried to stay calm and follow through with the process. The tension in the bank grew thick as Jessica sat frozen in front of the screen. She had done everything by the book, following each step exactly as she had been trained. But something about this situation felt different. The quiet whispers of the other clients in line, their eyes darting between Jessica and Melania, made her feel like she was under a spotlight. She could feel the weight of their stares as the seconds ticked by. Melania's assistant was the first to break the silence. The woman, dressed in an expensive suit, shifted her weight impatiently from one foot to the other. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Jessica tap away at the keyboard, trying to bypass the security alert. "This is ridiculous," the assistant snapped, her voice rising above the hum of the bank. "You're treating her like a criminal. Do you realize who she is?" Jessica flinched at the sharpness of the assistant's words. She didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to apologize and back down, but the other part of her knew she couldn't. She had a job to do. She was following the bank's procedures, even if those procedures were making things uncomfortable for everyone involved. The assistant crossed her arms, a look of disbelief on her face. "This is a complete waste of time. You should be able to process this without all this extra nonsense." Jessica's hands trembled as she glanced at Melania. She could feel the former First Lady's gaze, calm but focused, like a quiet storm. Jessica opened her mouth to explain again, but before she could get the words out, Melania spoke. "Why is this taking so long?" Melania's voice was still polite, but there was a sharp edge to it now, a hint of frustration creeping through. She had been calm at first, but Jessica could hear the change in her tone. The wait, the constant questioning, it was starting to get to her. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mrs. Trump," Jessica said, trying to steady her voice. "But the system requires additional verification for this type of transaction. It's part of the new security protocol. I can't override it without further steps." Melania's expression didn't change, but the frustration in her eyes was clear. "I've been through security checks at countless banks, and never have I been treated like this. What's the problem now?" Jessica opened her mouth, but her mind went blank. She had explained this already. The system wasn't allowing her to proceed. It wasn't her fault, but how could she explain that without sounding defensive? How could she make Melania, or anyone, understand that she was simply doing her job? Behind her, the murmurs from the other clients grew louder. The situation was becoming a spectacle, and the more they whispered, the more Jessica felt exposed. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She had wanted this job, had worked hard to get it, but now she was standing here, feeling like a fool, caught between a rock and a hard place. The assistant's voice interrupted her thoughts. "This is unbelievable. You're wasting her time for no reason. Maybe if you knew who she was, you wouldn't be treating her like this." The assistant's words were like a slap, and Jessica winced at the harshness in her tone. Jessica took a deep breath. She had to keep her composure. She had to stay calm and stick to the rules. She couldn't let her nerves show, no matter how much the situation was spiraling out of control. "I understand your frustration," she said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "But the rules are clear. I can't process this without completing the verification. I have to follow protocol." Melania's frustration was growing, but she still held it together. "This is absurd," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "I've done everything right. Why am I being treated like this?" Jessica felt like her stomach had dropped into her shoes. She wanted to explain, to say that it wasn't her fault, that she was just following the rules. But the more she spoke, the more the pressure built. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, the assistant's angry comments echoing in her mind, and the weight of Melania's disappointed gaze felt like it was crushing her. With every second, it felt like the walls of the bank were closing in on her. She had never felt so exposed in her life. The more she tried to explain, the more it seemed like she was digging herself into a hole she couldn't get out of. But despite the pressure, Jessica stood firm. "I'm sorry, but I can't change the rules," she said again, more quietly this time. "I have to follow the security steps." For a moment, Melania said nothing, her eyes fixed on Jessica. The tension in the air was suffocating. The bank had gone silent. Even the murmurs had stopped. It was like everyone was waiting for something to break, to give way to the tension that had built up. And then, just as the weight of the moment seemed unbearable, Melania let out a soft sigh. It wasn't a sigh of anger, but of resignation. "Fine," she said, her voice still calm but tinged with frustration. "Let's just get this over with." The assistant shot Jessica one last look of disbelief before stepping back, and Jessica quickly resumed typing into the system. Her hands still shook, but she was determined to finish this. She couldn't let herself fail, not now. But as she continued with the process, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The tension in the bank was no longer just about a simple transaction. It had become about respect, about power, and about the rules that governed them all. The door to the bank opened again, this time with a quiet but commanding presence. Barron Trump stepped inside. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. The air, which had been thick with tension and discomfort, suddenly seemed to grow still. People's heads turned in unison, and all eyes fixed on him. Barron was tall, his posture straight and confident. He moved through the lobby with an air of authority, his presence powerful but calm. He didn't speak loudly, but there was no doubt he was the focal point now. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she looked up from the counter. She had heard of Barron, of course, but seeing him in person, walking toward her and the scene that had already spiraled out of control, was overwhelming. The whispers stopped, and it felt like the whole bank was holding its breath. Melania looked up too, her eyes softening the moment she saw her son. There was an unspoken relief in her gaze, as if Barron's arrival meant the chaos that had consumed the past few minutes might finally come to an end. "What's going on here?" Barron's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. He didn't raise it, but it was firm, the kind of voice that commanded attention from anyone who heard it. He walked directly to the bank manager, Steve, and didn't break his stride. His eyes never left the manager's face. Steve's face drained of color. He had been trying to manage the situation, but with Barron's presence, everything had changed. He stammered for a moment, trying to find his words. We're just following protocol. There's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Trump. It's just a matter of... A misunderstanding? Barron interrupted, his gaze sharp. My mother has been here for over 20 minutes, and you're telling me this is a misunderstanding? She's trying to access her account, and you've made her wait, questioning her ID? Why? Jessica watched Barron as he addressed the manager. His presence was powerful, yet there was something about the way he stood that made everyone else seem smaller. The room seemed to shrink as all eyes were on him. Barron's words weren't loud, but they were clear and unrelenting. Melania's relief was evident. The tension that had clouded her face for the past few minutes faded as she looked at her son. Barron was the calm to her storm, and his arrival gave her a sense of comfort and control she had been missing. As Barron continued to speak, Jessica could feel the weight of the situation shift. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. And his disappointment was more powerful than any anger could have been. Barron turned to address the bank staff directly. "This is how you treat people who come in for a simple transaction?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "You treat them like criminals, put them through unnecessary delays, and make them feel small? This is unacceptable." Jessica felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had done everything she was supposed to, but it hadn't been enough. She had felt the humiliation building with every passing moment. But now, Barron was standing up for his mother, and in doing so, he was standing up for her too. His words, though directed at the bank staff, felt like they validated her actions. But more than that, Barron's words made something clear: sometimes, following the rules wasn't enough when it came to treating people with respect and dignity. It was clear now that it wasn't just the policies of the bank that were at fault, it was the way they had been applied, the way they had been used to humiliate people rather than protect them. Barron's disappointment in the bank staff was palpable, and for the first time in the tense minutes that had passed, Jessica felt like she wasn't alone in this. Barron turned to her briefly, his eyes meeting hers for just a second, before he addressed his mother. "Don't worry, Mom. This will be taken care of," he said, his voice soft but full of assurance. And in that moment, Jessica understood, Barron Trump wasn't just standing up for his mother. He was also standing up for what was right. The tension in the bank seemed to change in an instant when Barron Trump walked in. His entrance was as quiet as it was powerful. His tall frame cut through the room like a wave, and immediately, all eyes turned to him. Clients paused their conversations, staff members stopped what they were doing, and Jessica, who had been holding her breath, looked up in surprise. There was something about Barron that commanded attention without saying a word. It wasn't just the fact that he was a Trump, it was his presence, his confidence, the weight he carried with him, and the authority he exuded. The room seemed to fall silent as he made his way to the counter. Melania, who had been standing with a strained composure, exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. The moment Barron entered, a sense of relief washed over her. She knew things would be different now. Barron was here, and his very presence was enough to change the tide. "What's going on here?" Barron's voice cut through the thick silence. His tone was calm but sharp, carrying an underlying authority that made everyone in the room take notice. Jessica turned toward him, her heart racing, but she didn't speak. The bank manager, Steve, was the first to respond, his voice shaky as he stammered, "Mr. Trump, we're just following protocol. Mrs. Trump's transaction flagged a security alert, and we're simply following the new verification steps." Barron's expression didn't shift. He didn't show any sign of anger, but his disappointment was clear. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice even but full of weight. He glanced at his mother, who stood quietly beside him, her calm demeanor belying the frustration she had clearly been feeling. "You're treating my mother like a criminal because of some paperwork error?" Steve's face flushed, but he quickly regained his composure. No. It's just a procedure," he repeated, his voice now more defensive. "We have new security measures to follow, and we can't make exceptions." Barron didn't flinch. "Let me make this clear," he said, turning to face the manager fully. "My mother has been through more security checks than you can possibly imagine. She's been in the public eye for years, and you think a simple transaction is an excuse to question her like this?" His voice was calm but laced with disappointment. "This isn't about procedures or rules. This is about respect." Jessica's stomach churned as the scene unfolded. She hadn't expected Barron to step in like this. For a moment, she was frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Would Barron defend her? Would the entire situation escalate? Melania, who had been silent, stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to make a scene. I just want to access my account," she said. But I don't understand why I'm being treated like this. Why wasn't I informed of these new rules? Why wasn't I treated with the respect I deserve as a client? Barron turned back to the manager. This isn't just about my mother, he said, his gaze now sweeping across the room. This is about how people are treated in this bank. You've just humiliated her in front of everyone. Do you think this is acceptable? Steve was silent for a moment, his face pale. I apologize if this has caused any discomfort, Mr. Trump. It wasn't our intention to embarrass anyone. Barron wasn't done. You need to apologize to my mother, he said, his voice steady but full of authority. And you need to rethink how you treat your clients, especially those who have spent their lives in the public eye. This behavior is unacceptable, and it goes beyond a simple mistake in a system. It's about how people like my mother are treated by people like you. The crowd in the bank had been watching in stunned silence, but now they started whispering amongst themselves. Phones were being pulled out, cameras clicking as the tension built. It wasn't just about a transaction anymore, it was about power, respect, and the treatment of a high-profile individual in a space where people like Barron Trump were used to being treated with reverence. One client, an older woman, muttered under her breath, "They're treating her like she's nobody." Another woman shook her head in disbelief, her phone already recording the entire scene. The murmurs grew louder as the realization spread, this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a public spectacle, and it was being documented for everyone to see. Jessica, still standing behind the counter, felt the weight of Barron's words. She wasn't sure if he was defending her or if he was just speaking on behalf of his mother. Either way, it was clear that the situation had taken a turn. The rules that Jessica had followed without question now seemed insignificant in the face of what Barron was demanding, respect. Steve cleared his throat, trying to salvage the situation. "I'll make sure we review our policies, Mr. Trump. I apologize for the trouble this has caused." His voice was a little less sure now, as the power dynamics in the room had shifted dramatically. Barron nodded, but his eyes remained sharp. "Good," he said, his gaze now sweeping over the room, making sure his words landed. "This isn't just about getting an apology. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. You need to take a hard look at your policies and how they treat people. And you need to hold your staff accountable for treating everyone with dignity." Steve nodded, his face pale. "We will, Mr. Trump. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Barron turned back to his mother, offering her a reassuring look. "Thank you, but I want this to be public. The world needs to know that respect is non-negotiable, no matter who you are or where you come from." The cameras continued to flash, and the tension in the bank slowly began to dissipate as the realization of what had just unfolded sank in. The manager had promised a review, and Barron had made sure everyone in the room knew that change was necessary. The crowd fell silent as the weight of Barron's words echoed through the space. Jessica stood there, feeling a mix of emotions. It wasn't just about the apology anymore, it was about the shift in the room, the acknowledgement that people's dignity should never be compromised. And, for the first time in a long while, she felt validated, knowing that sometimes standing up for what's right meant more than following the rules. As the tension in the room started to settle, the bank's CEO entered with a lawyer and a couple of assistants in tow. His stiff, expensive suit contrasted with the sweat visible on his brow. The CEO had clearly been briefed on what had happened, and the nervousness in his step was undeniable. He walked directly toward Barron and Melania, his face tight with discomfort. "I'm deeply sorry for the inconvenience this has caused, Mr. Trump, Mrs. Trump," the CEO began, his voice polite but hurried. He extended a hand, but Barron didn't take it. Instead, he remained standing, his arms crossed. Barron's eyes were cold as he looked at the CEO. "Sorry? That's all you have to say? A simple apology isn't enough. My mother was humiliated in front of all these people because your staff didn't think to treat her with the respect she deserves." The CEO flinched slightly, his gaze shifting to Jessica for a moment, but he didn't address her directly. "We're implementing new security protocols, and clearly, there's been a misunderstanding in how they were enforced." Barron shook his head, his disappointment clear. "No, this isn't just about a misunderstanding. This is about deeper issues within your system. You've created policies that put people like my mother in a position where they're treated like criminals over a technicality. And you've done it in a way that leaves your staff, like Jessica here, to bear the brunt of it." The CEO opened his mouth to respond, but Barron held up a hand to silence him. "I'm not just talking about my mother. I'm talking about your whole system, the way people, especially people in positions like hers, are treated. You've put your employees in a position where they have to choose between doing their jobs and doing the right thing." Jessica, still standing behind the counter, felt her breath catch as Barron turned toward her. For the first time since the incident began, he addressed her directly. "You were just doing your job, Jessica. But this moment is bigger than you, bigger than this transaction. You were put in an impossible position, and you did the right thing by following the rules. But sometimes, the rules aren't enough. You have to stand up for what's right, even if it means challenging the system." Jessica felt her heart race as she processed Barron's words. She wasn't used to being seen, especially not in a situation like this, but Barron's acknowledgement made her feel like maybe she had done the right thing after all. It was a rare moment of validation. Turning back to the CEO, Barron spoke once more. "An apology isn't enough. You need to change your system. It's broken, and this is a wake-up call for you. The policies you've put in place have failed. And they need to be fixed, or else this will happen again, to someone else." The CEO nodded, his face pale, realizing the gravity of Barron's words. It wasn't just a customer service issue anymore, it was about accountability. And Barron was making sure that this time, it would be different. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted completely. The immediate tension had faded, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Jessica stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she watched Barron and Melania speak with the CEO. Her mind was still processing everything that had unfolded, the confrontation, the public apology, and the realization that she was a part of something much bigger than just a simple transaction. Jessica had always been just another bank teller, a cog in a system that operated by the rules. But today, she had been forced into a position where those rules clashed with doing the right thing. And for the first time, she understood that it wasn't just about following the policies, it was about standing up for what was just, even if it meant challenging everything around her. She had done that today. As Barron and Melania left the bank, Barron turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a sense of recognition. He approached her slowly, his footsteps purposeful as the room seemed to quiet down around them. The CEO was still talking to his team, no doubt scrambling to figure out how to fix everything. But Barron's attention was on Jessica now. "You did the right thing, Jessica," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Standing up for what's right isn't always easy. Sometimes, it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. But in moments like this, it's necessary. You might not have had the support you needed in the moment, but you made the right choice, and that's something not everyone can do." Jessica blinked, surprised by the directness of his words. She had been so focused on surviving the situation that she hadn't allowed herself to fully process the importance of her actions. She had followed the rules, yes, but she had also held her ground when it mattered. She had insisted on respect, even when everything around her seemed to be crumbling. Barron continued, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this. I know it might not seem like it, but there are people who understand. People who want change. You've already taken the first step toward that change. The world needs more people like you." The words hit her harder than she expected. For the first time, Jessica realized that she had power. Power that wasn't just about the position she held at the bank. It was the power to influence, to make a difference, and to be a catalyst for change in a system that often overlooked people like her. Barron's words echoed in her mind as she walked away from the counter, her heart still racing, but with a newfound sense of strength. The CEO had agreed to review the bank's policies, and Barron had promised to work with them to ensure that incidents like this wouldn't happen again. The system had failed, but today, it was on the path to change. Jessica felt empowered as she walked back to her workstation. This wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about something larger, a fight for respect, for dignity, and for fairness. She had been part of a turning point, and that realization filled her with purpose. She wasn't just a bank teller anymore. She was someone who had stood up for what was right, who had refused to let the system dictate her actions, and who now understood that her voice mattered. As she took her seat, Jessica felt a quiet sense of pride. The fight wasn't over, there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger, something that could change the world, one step at a time. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories that inspire change and challenge the system.